or not on today's agenda. Speaker slips are down front. To your right, my left, go ahead and complete one if you wish to address the board, and then you can turn them in to me when you're finished. We'll begin shortly.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the June 8th Air Pollution Control District of San Diego County Governing Board meeting. We're going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. Clerk, can you do roll?
Thank you, Chair Bush. I would like to remind those members of the public that are joining us via teleconference to please select your language of preference using the interpretation button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Before I call the roll, I would like to note for the record that members Lawson, Reamer, and Vargas have notified us that they will not be present at today's proceedings. All remaining board members are participating in person. With that, Member Birkbeck Garcia.
Birkbeck Garcia present.
Member Elo Rivera.
Present.
Member Gloria.
Here.
Member Gomez. Member Martinez.
Present.
Member Medina.
Here.
Member Sanchez. Vice Chair Shu.
Here.
Chair Bush.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on to the non-agenda public comment. Clerk, could you provide the public testimony instructions?
Thank you, Chair Bush. I would ask members of the public that would like to speak under non-agenda public testimony that are here in the chamber to please move forward at this time to the podium. Those members that are joining us via teleconference, please dial into the conference line now using the instructions provided on your Zoom screen. You may also indicate that you wish to speak on this item by using the raise hand feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen or by pressing *9 now.
Are there any members of the public that wish to address the board?
Seeing no hands raised, there are no members of the public wishing to address the board on this item.
All right, thank you. Moving on to consent, and there's no items on our consent calendar, so we're going to move on to approval of statement proceedings minutes for May 11th. Clerk, did you provide the public testimony instructions?
Thank you, Chair Bush. I would ask any members of the public that wish to address the board on this item to please dial into the Zoom screen now using the instructions that are provided on your screen. If there are any members of the public that wish to speak on this that are currently in the board chamber, you may approach the podium at this time. Those that are joining us via Zoom, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen or press *9 now. Seeing no hands raised, there are no members of the public wishing to address the board on this item.
All right, any comments from colleagues? Seeing none, can I get a motion?
I'll move approval of minutes.
I'll second.
Clerk, could you call the roll?
Thank you, Chair. Member Birkbeck Garcia,
Yes.
Member Elo Rivera,
Yes.
Member Gloria,
Aye.
Member Gomez, Member Martinez,
Yes.
Member Medina,
Medina, aye.
Member Sanchez, Vice Chair Shu,
Shu, aye.
Chair Bush.
Bush, yes.
Thank you. With members Gomez, Lawson, Reamer, Vargas, and Sanchez absent, that motion passes with those board members who are present voting aye.
All right, thank you, clerk. So we'll move on to our agenda, item E1, which is a public hearing. We're holding this public hearing and adopting the Air Pollution Control Officer's recommended budget for fiscal year 23-24 that we were presented with last meeting. Clerk, could you provide the public testimony instruction? And after that, we'll go ahead and have our Deputy Director, Mike, walk us through the presentation.
Thank you, Chair Bush. I would ask members of the public that have requested to speak on this item that are here in the board chamber to please have a seat in the front row behind the podium at this time. Those members that are joining us via teleconference, please dial into the conference line now using the instructions provided on your Zoom screen. You may also indicate that you wish to speak on this item by using the raise hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen or by pressing *9 now. All public testimony will be heard at the conclusion of the staff presentation. I would also like to note for the record that Member Gomez has joined the meeting.
All right, moving on to staff presentation.
Great, thank you very much. Just waiting for the slides to pop up here. Oh, there we go. All right. Thank you very much, Chair Bush, and good afternoon, board members. Today's hearing is the second public hearing for adoption of the fiscal year 23-24 budget. The first hearing, held on May 11th, was exclusively for the purpose of reviewing the proposed budget and providing the public with the opportunity to comment. Public notice on the recommended budget was mailed directly to every air quality permit holder, sent to subscribers of the district's email notification service in English and Spanish, and posted to the district's social media accounts in advance of last month's meeting. Additional outreach to solicit feedback on the proposed budget was conducted leading up to today's adoption hearing, and no additional comments have been received. Next slide, please. A detailed discussion on the recommended budget was provided during the first hearing, and today I'll be providing a brief overview. There have been no changes to the proposed revenues or expenditures presented at that time. The proposed budget document, which can be found on the district's website, details the spending plan for the district under the direction of the governing board. The recommended budget is balanced and reflects a proposed total of $116 million in revenues and expenditures for fiscal year 23-24. Next slide, please. Some of the fiscal year 23-24 highlights and key projects that are included in this budget are $59.4 million in pass-through grant funding for projects to incentivize reductions in air pollution from motor vehicles and mobile equipment, which includes nearly $25 million for projects that reduce emissions in under-resourced communities. The primary source of this funding comes from state programs such as Carl Moyer and the AB 617 Community Air Protection Program. $3.5 million to support environmental justice programs and ongoing community monitoring in the portside and international border environmental justice areas. This includes resources for continued enhancement of district outreach efforts countywide in support of the environmental justice framework and the public participation plan. The primary source of funding for these efforts comes from state AB 617 Community Air Protection Program implementation grants. There's $2.2 million for the district's robust mobile source compliance program, which enforces state mobile source regulations pursuant to an MOU with the California Air Resources Board. Revenues collected from vehicle registration fees are used to fund this program. And $140,000 for ongoing implementation of the Portside Air Quality Improvement and Relief Program, or PAIR, which provides portable air purifiers and indoor air monitors to residents in the Portside community. This funding comes from the district's Supplemental Environmental Project Program, which was established to fund community-based projects from a portion of penalties received during the enforcement actions. Next slide, please. To help ensure critical services are provided and to meet district goals and objectives, there are 177 total full-time equivalent staff years, or FTE, included in the fiscal year 23-24 recommended budget. This includes 175 existing positions and 2 recommended new positions. Recent changes in state emission inventory requirements, as well as enhancement of APCD's work in local environmental justice communities, have greatly increased the work of our engineering team and the Office of Environmental Justice. To help address these programmatic changes, the recommended budget includes funding for 1 air quality specialist on the engineering team to support implementation of new requirements adopted by the California Air Resources Board for emissions inventories, and 1 air quality specialist in the Office of Environmental Justice to support continued implementation and expansion of the Community Air Protection Program in environmental justice areas. Next slide, please. The recommended budget includes increases to the operating reserve account to ensure that approximately 2 months of operating expenditure reserves are available if necessary to maintain core programs and services in cases of unforeseen economic shortfalls, as well as increases to the financial systems replacement account for a potential initial contribution to be used to scope, procure, and implement a new financial system replacement. The recommended budget also includes continuing the trend of reducing the use of fund balance to cover ongoing operations and program costs, with a decrease of approximately $1 million in the proposed use of fund balance for these expenses budgeted for fiscal year 23-24. Next slide, please. The district conducted additional outreach on the availability of the proposed fiscal year 23-24 budget and opportunity to provide feedback during the public comment period, which included weekly social media posts, notifications to email subscribers in English and Spanish, and announcements made during community meetings held over the last few weeks. The district will continue to enhance outreach efforts as part of the development process for future year budgets to solicit stakeholder input and increase transparency. This includes conducting a workshop during the budget development process to provide more details on district funding sources and how they can be used, as well as soliciting feedback on how the budget can ensure that district programs continue to serve all residents in the region. Next slide, please. The requested actions for today are to adopt a resolution approving the Air Pollution Control Officer's recommended budget for fiscal year 23-24, and to find that the requested action is exempt from the requirements of the California Environmental Quality Act. Next slide, please. This concludes our presentation today, and we're available to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Watt. Do members of the board have any technical questions before we go ahead and move on to public comment and then our own action discussion? No questions? Seeing none, can we move on to the public comment, clerk?
Thank you, Chair Bush. We have received no requests to speak on this item from members of the public. However, if there are any members of the public in the chamber or online that wish to address the board on this item, you may approach the podium at this time or press *9 or use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Seeing no hands raised, there are no members of the public wishing to address the board on this item.
Thank you, clerk. Going on to board member comments. So any members have questions, comments? And I see none, so could I get a motion to adopt? Oh, did we close the public hearing first? Okay.
I'll move to close the public hearing.
We can close, this became an issue last time. We can do it all in the same motion. Okay, so I need a motion to close the public hearing and adopt the budget.
So I'll amend my motion to close the public hearing and adopt staff recommendation on items 1, 2, and 3 of number 1.
Martina seconds.
All right, motion and a second. Any other comments? Clerk, please call the roll.
Thank you, Chair Bush. Member Beck Garcia,
Beck Garcia, yes.
Member Elo Rivera,
Yes.
Member Gloria,
Aye.
Member Gomez.
Yes.
Member Martinez.
Yes.
Member Medina,
Medina, aye.
Member Sanchez, Vice Chair Shu,
Shu, aye.
Chair Bush.
Bush, yes.
Thank you. With members Lawson, Reamer, Sanchez, and Vargas absent, that motion passes with those board members who are present voting aye.
Thank you, clerk. Moving on to item E2, the 2022 annual air quality report. This is information item. Clerk, could you provide the public testimony instructions and then we'll have the staff presentation.
Thank you, Chair Bush. I would ask any members of the public that would like to speak on this item that are here in the chamber to please approach the first row at this time and go ahead and have a seat. Those members that are joining us via teleconference, please raise your hand using the raise hand feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen or press *9 now. All public testimony will be heard at the conclusion of the staff presentation.
All right, and with that, we'll move on to the staff presentation.
Thank you, Chair Bush. We'll just wait for the slides on the screen. All right. Good afternoon, Chair Bush, governing board members and members of the public. I'm Domingo Vigil, Deputy Director for the San Diego County Air Pollution Control District. It is my pleasure today to introduce the 2022 Annual Air Quality Report. Next slide, please. California Assembly Bill 423 requires San Diego County Air Pollution Control District to publish an annual air quality report that includes levels of air pollution, monitoring information, enforcement actions, revenue secured, program outcomes, and emission reductions progress. Accordingly, as the APCD has produced this air quality report that provides information on the state of the air in the region and relevant updates on the impact we have made as a district in improving air quality during the 2022 calendar year. I would now like to introduce our Public Information Officer, Melina Mesa, to walk you through some highlights of the report. As a reminder, this is an informational item and no action is requested from the board. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Domingo. As Domingo stated, this is our second annual report as an independent agency. And while the first had a focus on who we are as an agency, the 2022 report focuses mainly on 2022 accomplishments and milestones. In addition, this report includes brief information about the health impacts of air quality and why it's so important for the San Diego County community to have clean air. Next slide, please. In this next section, it will cover some highlights in the report, but for the full picture, I encourage everyone to review the report in its entirety online. Next slide, please. We will start with one of the most important aspects of the report, which is the state of the air in San Diego County. Up on the screen, we have a graph of the ozone trend in the county over the past 5 years. Although we are close to reaching attainment status, we need to continue working towards lowering VOCs and NOx emissions, which are the primary contributors that, when heated, create bad ozone. In order to improve the ozone, the district is amending and introducing rules for stationary sources, offering incentive and grant programs, as well as identifying new funding opportunities. Lastly, the California State Implementation Plan was approved in 2020 to address the remaining gap to achieve attainment status. Next slide, please. In this next graph, we will look at another pollutant that's an important indicator, which is PM 2.5. And the good news is that we are currently in attainment status. However, with recent EPA plans to lower the annual standard to a value between 8 to 11 micrograms per cubic meter, it could be a significant impact. If the EPA lowers the standard, San Diego County would likely move into non-attainment status. Regardless of the standard, as an agency, we will continue to seek opportunities to reduce PM 2.5 emissions. Next slide, please. Next, on to one of the key components of our work, and that is our rules. Our rules govern how we oversee stationary sources and work towards cleaner air. In 2022, we amended 4 rules that were primarily focused on cost recovery per federal requirements. Rule 45 established a fee to be collected from federal major stationary sources of VOCs and NOx, which are precursors of ozone. If the region fails to attain the 75 parts per billion ozone standard by the required federal attainment date of 2026. Next slide, please. Next, on to environmental justice, which environmental justice has been an important area of focus. In 2022, the board adopted an environmental justice framework and an equity statement to guide all district actions to better serve those communities that have had a disproportionate air pollution burden. In order to improve transparency and public engagement, the district developed a public participation plan, which sets guidelines and strategies to ensure the community is involved in projects and decisions within SD-APCD. Lastly, there is our newest AB 617 community, the International Border Community, which encompasses San Ysidro, Otay Mesa East, and in 2022, the steering committee for this group began the process of developing a community air monitoring plan and a community emissions reduction plan. These plans are one of the first steps in improving the air quality in the border community. Next slide, please. Other ways in which the district works towards cleaner air is by incentivizing clean technology. In 2022, the district approved $9.3 million in incentive funding for heavy-duty diesel equipment replacement and repower projects, as well as 2 electric buses for the El Cajon Valley School District. These are projects that improve air quality, protect public health, and support local businesses transition to cleaner equipment. All in all, these projects will result in over 440 tons of air pollution reductions over the project's lifetimes. Additionally, the district has grant agreements in place for another $42 million in incentive funding that will provide additional emission reduction benefits once those projects are completed. Next slide, please. In order to do all of our work, we need air monitoring so that we understand if we are making progress or if more work needs to be done. In 2022, the Regional Comprehensive Monitoring Plan was approved to provide a blueprint for the district to determine where to place its ambient air monitoring locations and what pollutants to measure at each location. As part of this process, the district uses a variety of publicly available data sets to evaluate which communities should have additional air monitoring, including CalEnviro Screen, the EPA's EJ Screen, and the California Healthy Place Index. In addition, SD-APCD collaborates and considers information from community residents and stakeholders to establish additional monitoring stations. Next slide, please. As part of our enhanced complaints program, the district investigates all air quality complaints received from the public that fall under the district's jurisdiction. In 2022, we implemented a 24/7 complaints line so members of the public can report complaints at any time. And last year, we completed 590 investigations with an average response time of 6.9 hours. And we would like to note that this response time is well below the 48-hour response time required by the state. Next slide, please. Lastly, the district is greatly expanding the number of stationary sources and the number of pollutants for which it conducts an annual emissions inventory, from approximately 200 to over 4,400 facilities per year. This is in response to the new CARB requirements for emission inventories. Next slide, please. The report is currently available in English on the district's website and will be translated into Spanish, Tagalog, Chinese, Arabic, and Vietnamese. And for additional languages, the public can contact the district for a translation request. The report will be broadly distributed via social media, our email distribution service, a press release, and through our partner organizations. Next slide, please. Today's item is for informational purposes only regarding the release of the SDAPCD's 2022 Annual Air Quality Report, and no action is requested from the board today. This concludes staff presentation, and we are available to answer any questions you may have.
All right, thank you, staff, and really appreciate your guys' hard work on this report and just updating on what you all have been doing this last year. I've definitely noticed you all have stepped up in community outreach and engagement, so really appreciate you all doing that, and that's reflected in this report. So with that, do we go through public comments? Yep. Okay, public comments and then board comment.
Thank you, Chair Bush. We've received no request to speak from any members of the public online or here in the chamber. However, if there are members that have joined us recently and would like to address the board on this item, you may come to the podium at this time, or you may press *9 or use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen at this time. Seeing no movement in the chamber and no hands raised online, there are no members of the public wishing to address the board on this item.
All right, thank you, Clerk. Any comments from our members? Yes, Mayor Gloria.
Thank you, Chair. Just wanted to express my appreciation to staff, not just for the work that comes into creating the document, but also the work that you're accounting for. It's impressive. It's way more transparent to the public. Member Gomez and I were discussing about our impression on how much this organization and agency does. It's impressive. I'm glad it's placed to encapsulate it and transmit it, and particularly in a very accessible way, not just through formats, but also in language. So again, I impressive, not to be taken for granted, and definitely appreciate it.
Thank you, Member Gloria. Member Shu, Vice Chair Shu.
Thank you, and thank you for all of you. I really like and appreciate the emphasis that we're after cleaner air, and as it affects people's health. So I think it reiterates our purpose is to reduce health impacts wherever they may be coming from in our region. My comment is there, you gave an overview in terms of NOx and 2.5 particulate matter. Is there a differentiation? I imagine there is. We know about environmental justice issues. What is the amount of differentiation within our community with regards to either NOx or 2.5 particulate matter? What's the degree of difference as we deal with the question of equity and environmental justice?
Are you talking about difference in terms of emissions? I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I understand.
The chart shows that for 2.5, we're doing okay on a region-wide basis. But I think we know there may be some differentiation with one community to another. So if you took the average or the best air quality parts of our region, how does this compare with the worst?
Correct. So if I understand correctly, you're talking about the differences between the regional state of the air versus on a community basis. And we are currently more engaged in community-based monitoring in the portside community and in the international border community. And we found, in relatively higher levels of PM in those particular communities. However, this report itself encompasses more of the regional state of the air quality. So that's why the emphasis was made on presenting the information just for the entire region. But we are also working through our AB 617 program in providing not just additional monitoring resources, but also incentive programs to those particular communities to help with reducing the levels of pollution in those communities at that level.
Great. And I think for me, it's good to know what the overall rating is, let's say for 2.5. But we know there are some places we're not doing very well. In fact, in some places we're doing pretty poorly. So for me, it helps for us to show that differentiation and maybe where those places are, so that as we go on in today's meeting and future meetings, we do get to where we need the help the most. That's done in education. We'll look for the students that are most far behind and find a way to help them. So for me, it helps to know how far we are behind in those communities. And we see the amount of difference. And I think sometimes we're appalled at the amount of difference between who has good air to breathe and who don't.
Yes,
If you want to elaborate more, you can, but we should go to other items on the agenda. But I thought some emphasis on that in future reports would be appreciated.
Absolutely. Thank you.
The staff good?
Yeah.
Oh, did you have something else? Okay, we're good. All right, any other member comments before we move on? Okay, seeing none, let's move on to item number E3, provide update and seek direction on potential strategies to reduce indirect source emissions from warehouses, distribution centers, and ports in San Diego County. Clerk, could you provide the public testimony instructions? And then we'll move on to staff report.
Thank you, Chair Bush. I would like to note for the record that Member Sanchez did join our meeting at the beginning of the last item. With that, any members of the public that have requested to speak on this item here in the chamber, I would ask that you have a seat in the first row of the chamber behind the podium. Those that are joining us via teleconference, please dial into the teleconference line now using the instructions that are provided on the screen. You may also indicate that you wish to speak on this item by using the raise hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen or by pressing *9 now. All public testimony will be heard at the conclusion of the staff presentation.
All right, thank you, clerk. And we will move on to the staff presentation and then public comments.
Thank you. We'll get the slide presentation up here shortly. There we go. Okay, great. Well, good afternoon again, Chair Bush and governing board members. Today's presentation will provide an overview of staff's research and findings on the potential strategies to reduce indirect source emissions from warehouses and ports in San Diego County. I'm joined today by Randy Consolation and Nick Cormier from our rural development team, who have put a tremendous amount of work into analyzing and compiling the information presented here today and in the summary report that was released 2 weeks ago. I really want to recognize and thank both of them for their efforts on this very important topic today. Next slide, please. This is an overview of what we'll be covering in today's presentation, which generally follows the summary report included as attachment A in today's board item. First, I will provide some background information about indirect sources, the health impacts from their emissions, and the district's limits to regulating their emissions. Next slide, please. Assembly Bill 423 directed the district to consider adopting an indirect source rule to address air pollution from mobile sources that are associated with stationary sources, such as ports, warehouses, and distribution centers. The Clean Air Act defines an indirect source as a facility, building, structure, installation, real property, road, or highway which attracts or may attract mobile sources of pollution. Next slide, please. Indirect sources of air pollution primarily emit two types of pollutants: nitrogen oxides, or NOx, which is a precursor to ground level ozone, and diesel particulate matter, or DPM. NOx and DPM are emitted from different types of sources, but most notably from mobile sources such as on-road and off-road vehicles. Elevated exposure to both pollutants can cause many respiratory and cardiovascular symptoms, the most common of which are listed on this slide and are a public health concern. Next slide, please. California Health and Safety Code provides the district with the authority to control air pollution from all sources, with the exception of emissions from motor vehicles. However, there are limits to the district's authority with respect to indirect sources of air pollution, which needs to consider whether local regulations are preempted by federal law. For example, the Clean Air Act does not allow a local air district to adopt a motor vehicle emission standard. An indirect source rule cannot be a de facto purchase mandate for new vehicles to meet a particular emission standard. Providing alternative methods of rule compliance that include non-vehicular compliance options is a potential path to avoid federal preemption. This pathway is still being tested in litigation, as we will discuss in more detail later in the presentation. The district's authority also cannot interfere with California Proposition 26, which mandates that any fee component of a rule cannot be considered a tax because that would require a vote of the people and cannot be considered an improper regulatory fee. The district's authority also cannot interfere with local, city, or county control over land use decisions. Next slide, please. Let's now discuss the inventory and population of the first category of indirect source emissions researched by district staff, which are warehouses and distribution centers. For simplicity, the term warehouses will be used in this presentation when referencing both warehouses and distribution centers. I'll now turn it over to Randy to walk us through this next section of the presentation. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Mike. And good afternoon, governing board members. This map shows the locations of the approximately 6,700 warehouses located throughout San Diego County, ranging in size from less than 1,000 to 3.3 million square feet. It is important to note that not all of these warehouses may be involved in activities that result in indirect source emissions, something the district would need to further refine during possible rule development. In total, indirect source emissions from all warehouses in the region are estimated to be around 1,100 tons per year of NOx and 11 tons per year of DPM. The district calculated these totals using similar methodologies as South Coast AQMD, which were scaled as needed to reflect conditions in San Diego. This includes average truck trip rates, which were calculated in proportion to square footage, meaning larger facilities were assumed to generate more truck trips than smaller facilities. The total indirect source emissions from warehouses equates to approximately 4% of the countywide inventories for both NOx and DPM. Next slide, please. These pie charts further illustrate the emissions impact of indirect source emissions from warehouses with respect to total region-wide estimates of NOx and DPM emissions. The yellow and gray wedges in both charts represent other mobile and on-road mobile sources. Other mobile sources are generally comprised of equipment that are under federal regulatory authority, such as aircraft, trains, and ships. The orange and blue wedges represent area-wide and stationary source NOx and DPM emissions. Estimated warehouse indirect source emissions are in the wedges highlighted in yellow. Baseline warehouse emissions were first calculated using South Coast methodologies, and then those emissions were deducted from the on-road mobile category in gray. Next slide, please. The size of warehousing facilities is also an important factor to consider with indirect sources and the truck trips they generate. This table breaks down the total floor area of warehouses countywide by percent and by area. Many of the largest warehouses in the county are concentrated in the international border area. Additionally, warehouses with at least 100,000 square feet of floor space represent about 28% of the total floor space countywide. Next slide, please. Now that we've gone over the inventory and emissions from warehouses in San Diego County, let's now discuss the initial outreach the district conducted during our research, as well as the primary method for how such emissions are being controlled at the South Coast AQMD. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Staff conducted significant outreach discussing indirect source emission control strategies during more than 50 individual meetings with affected stakeholders, community members, and AB 617 steering committees. Out of these discussions, several common themes emerged from stakeholders and the public. These included requests to assess reducing indirect source emissions from warehouses under 100,000 square feet, and to expedite possible compliance around sensitive receptors, such as schools and residences. Stakeholders also urged the district to minimize administrative burden, avoid duplicative state or federal compliance requirements, and ensure access to incentive funding remains open. Next slide, please. Staff evaluated existing strategies implemented at other air districts. The only such measure adopted to date for warehouses is South Coast AQMD Warehouse Rule 2305. The rule applies to 3,300 warehouses in the South Coast Air Basin and regulates facilities with 100,000 square feet or more of indoor floor space. The rule, by design, provides a menu of implementation options for facilities to consider when complying. This menu approach allowed the rule to be more legally defensible in relation to federal preemption concerns. Smaller warehouses may not have the same options available to comply and would require further evaluation to include in the rule. Affected warehouses must earn a certain number of points depending on the number of truck trips made to and from a subject warehouse each year. Warehouses earn points by implementing any combination of items from the menu or by paying a mitigation fee, which can then be used by South Coast AQMD to fund clean technology projects in impacted communities. Reporting and fee requirements for facilities also apply, which are governed by a separate fee rule, Rule 316. Next slide, please. The menu of more than 30 different control options available to comply with Rule 2305 is shown here. These options include the purchase and use of low NOx and zero emission trucks, and infrastructure, solar panel, or air filtration system installations. As mentioned previously, South Coast AQMD developed the menu of options specific to larger warehouses to avoid federal preemption concerns. Next slide, please. It's important to note that despite efforts to mitigate against claims of federal preemption violations, South Coast Rules 2305 and 316 are currently involved in active litigation. The lawsuits claim the South Coast AQMD rules exceed the Air District's authority, are preempted by federal law, and impose an improper regulatory fee. The court has not yet issued a ruling and has not indicated when a ruling can be expected. If a similar rule were pursued in San Diego, it is anticipated similar claims and litigation will be raised. The outcome of the South Coast AQMD litigation will help inform a local regulation. District staff are tracking developments and will keep the governing board apprised. Next slide, please. Now that we understand the emission control method at South Coast AQMD for warehouses, let's now discuss how a similar measure might work in San Diego, as well as the costs and benefits associated with pursuing such a measure. Next slide, please. A rule similar to South Coast Rule 2305 in San Diego would apply to warehouses at or above 100,000 square feet in size. The rule would also provide regulatory consistency for warehouses in adjacent air districts and trade corridors using an established regulatory model. To understand the potential scope of facilities affected, this map shows the locations of facilities that would be in this size range as depicted by black dots. Next slide, please. This map now overlays warehousing facility locations that are between 50,000 and 100,000 square feet in size, as depicted by red dots. As the map illustrates, many of these locations are clustered around the larger facilities. Next slide, please. Next, this map shows the remaining smaller warehouses throughout the county that are under 50,000 square feet in size, as depicted by blue dots. These locations are much more spread out throughout the entire region. As a reminder, a potential warehouse indirect source rule similar to South Coast Rule 2305 with a size threshold of 100,000 square feet and greater would not cover facilities shown in red and blue. Next slide, please. Finally, this map overlays all warehouse locations countywide in relation to DPM percentiles using the mapping tool CalEnviroscreen. The census tracts in dark blue have higher DPM concentrations due to their proximity to freeways. The locations of warehouses countywide generally track with many of the dark blue census tracts with higher DPM scores. Next slide, please. District staff believes a rule similar in scope to South Coast Rule 2305 is potentially feasible pending further study and could provide health benefits over a 10-year period. However, a possible rule is predicted to be the costliest or least cost-effective measure the district has ever enacted in terms of the compliance cost per pound of reduced emissions. A local rule would apply to approximately 240 warehouses with at least 100,000 square feet of indoor floor space and is estimated to reduce up to 50 tons of NOx per year and up to 0.27 tons of DPM per year. Preliminary estimates of average cost effectiveness for proposed rule in San Diego County, scaled from South Coast analysis, currently range between $62 to $116 per pound of NOx reduced. However, a full socioeconomic impact study would be necessary to determine the estimated costs and benefits at the local level. The slide includes a graph comparing possible ISR emission reduction and cost effectiveness values, highlighted in green, to other recent and proposed rulemakings and incentive programs, shown in blue and red. Average annual compliance costs that facilities would need to pay for equipment and infrastructure upgrades are estimated to be between $14,000 and $26,000 per year, though actual costs would vary site to site. Next slide, please. Some costs would be borne by the district if rulemaking is pursued. Phase 1, prior to rule adoption, would incur expenditures to procure a contractor to prepare required technical assessments for rulemaking, as well as CEQA documentation, which is likely to be an EIR. Phase 2, post-rule adoption, would incur expenditures for web portal development, enhanced outreach, possible additional labor costs, and potential litigation costs. Finally, Phase 3 would incur potential additional district labor costs for implementation, web portal maintenance, and possible litigation costs. Next slide, please. It's important to note the various federal, state, and local activities that will concurrently reduce mobile source emissions from warehouses and port facilities. Many other actions have and will continue to be taken to encourage and accelerate the heavy-duty zero-emission vehicle market, both from a regulatory and non-regulatory standpoint, to reduce emissions from the freight sector. These efforts will provide significant emission reductions over the next few decades, whether or not a local indirect source rule is pursued. Next slide, please. To illustrate this point, this graph shows the impact of some recently adopted CARB regulations on future warehouse NOx emissions. Baseline emissions for warehouses 100,000 square feet and larger, shown in red, account for historical legacy state and federal regulations in place today. The blue bars show the same data, but factors in only CARB regulations without an ISR in place. Such regulations include CARB's low NOx omnibus and advanced clean truck regulations, but notably does not include CARB's advanced clean fleets regulation, which is adopted recently. The area between the green and blue bars in 2027 and 2035 respectively represents the maximum potential additional emission reductions a possible warehouse ISR would achieve, which is approximately 50 tons per year of NOx. Next slide, please. Shifting gears, Nick Cormier will now discuss indirect source emissions from ports. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Randy, and good afternoon, Chair Bush and governing board members. The Port of San Diego's Maritime Clean Air Strategy, or MCAS, helped the port identify and prioritize future projects and initiatives to reduce emissions while supporting efficient and modern maritime operations. The district supports the port's direction, and APCD stands ready to work proactively and collaboratively in helping achieve these ambitious milestones. However, just as MCAS implementation will be complex, controlling indirect source emissions from port sources is also expected to encounter implementation and legal challenges. For example, the extended timeline required to develop and implement a rule for ports would not be appropriate to help achieve near-term MCAS goals. Furthermore, much of the NOx and DPM emissions from port operations are generated from ships, which are challenging to regulate at the local level. Finally, a new rulemaking structure would need to be evaluated that still avoids federal preemption concerns. Next slide, please. South Coast AQMD is now working on a proposed port indirect source rule applying to both port authorities and port tenants. However, as of today, no air district has adopted such a rule. South Coast rule is also expected to focus first on non-refrigerated container terminals, which the Port of San Diego does not have. For these reasons, the district believes there is an opportunity to work collaboratively with the Port of San Diego to help meet near-term MCAS goals. To do this, the district proposes to pursue a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, with the port to partner on concrete actions that will result in emission reduction, facilitative, and health protective mitigation measures along the port tidelands. An MOU, if pursued, can be developed more quickly than a rule and is considered more suitable for inclusion of facilitative and incentive-based measures. An MOU also allows more flexibility to allocate incentive funding that may still be considered surplus to regulation, whereas a rule would significantly limit such funding opportunities. Next slide, please. The Port and APCD staff have had preliminary discussions on the types of projects and actions that could be incorporated into a possible MOU. Some examples include commitments from the port to replace diesel-fueled equipment with newer, cleaner technology or fuels. Examples of facilitative projects may include actions that cannot easily quantify emission reductions, such as enhanced outreach opportunities or installation of zero-emission charging or fueling infrastructure. Finally, examples of health protective mitigation measures might include commitments to enhance existing programs like APCD's air purifier and air monitoring programs, or enhanced enforcement of truck routes in the portside area. At an appropriate point and if pursued, the district envisions soliciting input from stakeholders about a potential MOU through a transparent public process. Next slide, please. The final portion of today's presentation will discuss outreach APCD conducted for the document that was released, possible timelines involved with future actions, as well as options that the board may consider taking. Next slide, please. The district posted the indirect source framework document, attachment A, on May 25th to elicit early feedback from stakeholders. The district also sent the document through our email subscription service to over 10,000 subscribers and included short, simplified bilingual informational videos on APCD's YouTube page. The Spanish version of the framework document was also posted on June 1st. APCD also disseminated the information through both AB 617 steering committees, social media, and to specific interested stakeholders and warehouse owners. The district will continue such enhanced outreach efforts in the months ahead. Next slide, please. If directed by the board, tentative timelines for possible rule development and/or MOU actions are as follows. For a warehouse ISR, staff would initiate actions to secure a contractor to prepare all required supplementary and CEQA documentation. A draft rule would be released for public comment and enhanced outreach next year. The CEQA process would be completed in early 2025, and staff would return to the board in mid-2025 for consideration of the CEQA analysis and proposed rule. For a possible port MOU, over the next few months, staff from both agencies would refine measures and actions to be included in the document. At an appropriate point, staff would include opportunities for public outreach and engagement with the community. District staff would then return at the end of this year to update the board on its status or request other options for the board to consider. An MOU would also require adoption by the Port Board of Commissioners concurrent to APCD's governing board adoption. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Nick and Randy. Appreciate your input on the report and all the work that you guys have done. So I'll summarize with some of the requested actions here. So developing a rule to address indirect source emissions from warehouses of 100,000 square feet and larger is potentially feasible in San Diego and could provide beneficial reductions in regional NOx and DPM emissions, although at a much higher cost per pound of pollutant reduced than other district rules. A rule could also provide localized emission reductions and associated public health benefits in the areas surrounding these larger warehouses, particularly in the international border community. However, due to the range of compliance options that would be necessary to avoid federal preemption issues, these localized benefits could not be guaranteed. Also, developing a rule to address indirect sources at smaller warehouses with less than 100,000 square feet would require identification of compliance options suitable for those smaller facilities, considering space limitations, operational constraints, and fewer emission sources. Some potential compliance options, such as solar panel installation, may produce regional but not localized air quality benefits, which has been identified as a priority for community stakeholders. District staff therefore recommends proceeding with requested action 1A to continue proactive engagement with community, jurisdictional, and industry stakeholders to convene a working group to explore alternative regulatory and non-regulatory strategies, which could provide more efficient and effective alternatives for reducing impacts at the community level. The working group would serve as a more structured platform than the individual stakeholder meetings held to date to bring relevant parties together to discuss potential alternative strategies, which could include incentive programs focused on smaller warehouses, impacting sensitive land uses, and exploring possible land use measures with other jurisdictional partners. While the working group explores these alternatives, district staff would continue to track the South Coast litigation to ensure the outcome is taken into account in any possible regulatory approach pursued locally. Staff has also provided 2 alternative options for warehouses for the board to consider. Option 1B would be to direct staff to begin formal rulemaking development activities for a warehouse indirect source rule for facilities at or above 100,000 square feet in size, and complete all required technical analyses to refine estimates on costs, benefits, and feasibility of implementation. Option 1C is the same as 1B, but adds direction to incorporate reporting requirements for smaller warehousing facilities to collect information needed by the district staff to evaluate the feasibility of regulating smaller facilities, considering relevant factors such as preemption limitations. For ports, staff also recommends proceeding with requested action 2, directing the district to pursue an MOU with the Port of San Diego and return to the governing board later this year with a status update. District staff stands ready to move forward with continued efforts to address indirect source emissions from warehouses and ports based upon the board's direction today. Next slide, please. This concludes our presentation, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, staff. Really appreciate that. I know that was very technical. There's a lot of information there. So I do want to turn it over to our board to ask technical questions of staff, and then we can go on to comments. So if any board members had any technical questions on the presentation, the information for clarification. Member Gomez?
Yeah, thank you. So the question that I have is the rationale of square footage versus trying to figure out how many trucks are coming into to deliver, pick up the goods. Because I don't necessarily equate bigger warehouses with more truck traffic. So I'm just curious if that was explored.
The connection there is there's a we're trying to learn from what South Coast did, right? And we used the truck trip generation rate, which is based on an assumed number of truck trips per square foot of warehousing space. And so that is what factors into the assumptions of larger warehouses drawing in more truck traffic. That is certainly something that would need to be refined more locally as part of a rule development effort to see if that same sort of truck trip generation rate applies equally in San Diego as it does in the South Coast area. But that's the connection and the dynamic between square footage and truck traffic. Is it's generally assumed that larger warehouses will pull in more truck traffic.
Okay, thank you.
But more study would be needed locally for sure.
Okay.
Member Medina?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And I do want to push a little further on this assumption between, square footage and truck trips. And the reason is I used to own a business and I used to truck fish across, the United States and Mexico and other places. And it's inventory turnover is the key. So you can have a warehouse that, holds non-perishable goods that can, be there for 6 months before they need to move them. Whereas you can have a smaller business that needs to move their goods and turns over their inventory a lot quicker. And so they would have more truck trips. So I'm not sure how strong is that association is the question that I would have.
Maybe I'll ask Nick or Randy to help out with that, but I think that, as I mentioned previously, that would definitely be something that needs to be studied a little further. There are also some factors associated with CEQA analyses that rely on that same relationship of truck trips per square foot, but the number is different. And so I think that would be one component to look at is seeing if that truck trip rate that we use based on South Coast analysis is appropriate, but then maybe looking into some of the concerns that you're addressing about, hey, it may not be, warehouse A of 100,000 square feet may not have the same truck trip generation rates as warehouse B. The other thing that I'll add is, as part of the South Coast regulation, and would most likely be something included in a regulation we would develop here, is the initial assessment would include reporting by each warehouse. And one of the factors that they're required to report on is how many truck trip visits they get. And so that additional data would be coming in as part of the initial reporting requirements associated with a potential regulation. But I don't know, Nick or Randy, if there's anything more to add on the generation rates.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the South Coast data, like Mike said, we were relying on pretty heavily. The data that we have, they used a number of studies to kind of conglomerated a bunch of these studies to get to the rates that we're using today, which is a number. Now, that's an average number. There could be some facilities that certainly do more than that as you're alluding to. There's some, could be a smaller 100,000 square foot warehouse that could be doing a lot of activity. There were some that may be less. But that's where they kind of use the average number based on the size of the facility. And I think one thing that, like Mike said, we would need to get as part of our rulemaking in San Diego would be getting a lot more data on the smaller facilities, which frankly, South Coast doesn't have a lot of data on. And that's one aspect, that's a critical aspect that we don't have right now, is to understand what is the truck trip generation rates occurring here, because their data didn't really conclude anything under 100,000 square feet. There wasn't a lot of data there. The data that was there was pretty old, and it applies to their region. So that's kind of where the reporting requirements would come in for smaller facilities if we were to do such a rule, to better understand what's going on at these facilities. And is it going to be more than 100,000 square feet? The data right now, that the older data that we have, seems to show that it could be less, but like you said, we would have to do some more work on our end to figure that out conclusively as part of our rulemaking process.
Okay, I have two other questions.
Let's go.
It's the benefits in terms of air quality. The road, number of trips is definitely one parameter, but I think the distance of that trip is very important. And if you can think of a portside warehouse that is supplying the shipyards, they have very short trips. Whereas I would say in the international border, most of them are probably going to Los Angeles. And maybe the shorter trip is the one from Tijuana to the warehouse, but the longer one is. So when we talk about benefits, there are regional benefits, as you alluded, and those would be from the longer truck trips, but there's also the neighborhood benefits and impacts that we would need to look at. And so is that something that you would explore, or how would that affect the rule?
I think the concept of regulating indirect sources as, it's the stationary source itself that's drawing in those truck trips to that facility and the localized impacts associated with that. And so the idea behind trying to incorporate requirements that reduce those impacts locally is at the core of an ISR. I think the ancillary benefits are those regional benefits you're describing about trucks making longer road trips, throughout the community. But really the core intent is, how can we best minimize the impacts at that stationary source, i.e. indirect source, because it's bringing in those truck traffic and bringing in that truck traffic and trying to reduce. And it could include, that's where this menu of options comes into play, could include things to try to facilitate or incentivize, zero emission trucks coming in, but also looking at what opportunities might exist on that site. For example, if they operate, diesel forklifts or cargo handling equipment or things of that nature, to really reduce the overall impact of the source locally. So that's the intent and the goal behind an ISR. The challenging part is navigating how to get to that point within some of the limitations that we have as an agency.
Okay, thank you. The last point that I have is there was the graph where you showed the reductions versus the cost. And I don't know if you want to pull it up, but I question whether we can compare stationary source reductions to mobile source reductions, and whether we're really looking at apples and oranges in my mind. And so when we look at the reductions from the incentive programs, I think the cost was actually higher than what an ISR rule would be. And so having those boiler rules there, which, I understand why you have them, but I think that maybe graphically it shows an erroneous picture of what we're talking about, because those are different sources, the way they are regulated.
We're working to pull up that graph so that folks can see, but staff, while our clerk pulls that up, did you have a response to that question?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. You know, that it is a different animal regulating mobile sources. And again, I want to be careful there because we don't have the authority to regulate mobile sources. We're regulating them indirectly through this indirect source approach. And so, you know, trying to at least identify from a cost per pound or ton reduced perspective, just showing that differentiation between it generally is more expensive to achieve emission reductions from these mobile sources, whether that's via regulation or, as you pointed out, via the incentive programs that we offer. The state provides us with funding and sets a cap for that very reason on how much we can spend from a cost perspective on how much dollars per pound we can spend on those reductions, because it is fairly expensive. And when you get into zero emission technology, it gets even more expensive because that equipment is significantly more costly than some of your diesel regulations. So completely understand the dynamic there. It's just challenging to show a direct comparison because we typically don't, and we haven't regulated sources of this type. This is the first foray into that.
Thank you.
All right, well, I think Member Gloria, did you have a question?
Thank you, Chair.
And then Member Sanchez.
The timeframe for implementing these, are we under any external time deadlines to make this rule?
No, there's no external time pressure there.
And then with regard to the Long Beach or South Coast litigation, forgive me, I think you may have said in the presentation, but I didn't catch it. How long is that anticipated to take?
We really don't know. That's an unknown at this point in time. The latest activity was associated with a request for summary judgment from the filer, and I believe South Coast and the state is planning on filing a similar request. The judge has not acted on that request yet, and so we don't know what the timeline would be for that. Could be 6 months, could be years.
Okay. And then with regard to the bifurcation of the warehouses and the port issue, I get it intellectually and how it's different. But in terms of the approach, I mean, staff recommendation is around a working group, things of that nature. Why the distinction between a working group and an MOU for the two different uses? You got to a little bit in your presentation about the flexibility it sounds like an MOU would provide. But I don't know how you get to an MOU for that, but a looser approach for the warehouses.
I think that the thought process there is with an MOU, we're dealing with one entity, right? The Port of San Diego, some opportunities potentially to achieve some of the reductions identified in the MCAS on a shorter time frame. Whereas with warehouses, you're talking about a multitude of facilities, depending on the threshold at which we look at, regulating those facilities. The other component there is, the threshold that's being tested currently, that's established in that South Coast rule of 100,000 square feet, as is noted in the presentation, may not get to some of those localized reductions because we simply don't have the warehouse population that South Coast has. And so the idea behind option 1A for the warehouses is simply to look at what other opportunities might exist, either from the regulatory perspective or non-regulatory perspective, to try to achieve what we think is the desired goal of reducing emissions at localized emissions at warehouses in the region. And so having that discussion with various members at the table to identify, whether it's incentives, whether it's, other types of ordinances, whether it's some combination of an air district ordinance and some of these other ideas, that's the concept behind having some further discussions with those stakeholders from the warehouse perspective. Hopefully that answers your question.
So the port situation is more precise and with fewer entities involved. The warehouse one is more amorphous and has way more people involved, and hence the working group for one, MOU for the other.
That's part of the idea, correct?
Okay. Just trying to keep up. You guys are so smart. This is not my wheelhouse. Last question, a little frivolous. The 3.3 million square foot warehouse, where is that?
That is I believe that's the Amazon facility.
Is it that large?
It's a
I mean, I've
very,
seen it
very
with my
large
own eyes,
facility.
but now I know what 3 million square feet look like. Okay. Thank you.
Member Sanchez.
Thank you. And we are so fortunate to have the author of AB 423, Mayor Gloria here, because that does require us to consider adopting an indirect rule to address the statutory sources such as ports, warehouses, and distribution centers. And I actually, the same kind of questions I had were similar to Mayor Gloria with respect to the status of the South Coast Rule 2305 and the litigation. So it sounds like the state is actively supporting South Coast, perhaps even filing amicus briefs.
That's my understanding, but maybe I'll ask Vera to chime in on that because she has more of the insight there.
Sure. So the Attorney General's Office and the State Air Resources Board, they've intervened on behalf of South Coast AQMD.
Great. So is the state actively working, say, with the feds to allow maybe some changes on the Fed side to allow this kind of activity? Do we know?
So the state has submitted the South Coast Rule 2305 into the state implementation plan to the EPA for approval. EPA, to my knowledge, has not acted on that yet, but they have forwarded it on to EPA. And the rule was adopted with the idea that it is legal, that it is within the authority, so they didn't have to seek for additional authority necessarily from EPA for the adoption of the rule.
Right.
But that is being tested legally. So it's sort of applying past practice and history based on previous activities and rules and case law. And this is the theory that is being tested currently.
Right. It almost sounds like it's a definitions, war of the definitions, because of course we're saying statutory versus, mobile. And it sounds like the limitation is not, saying statutory is not really being recognized as really, like where this is happening versus the mobile
I mean,
situation.
indirect source rule is almost separate from stationary, right? It's not quite stationary. It's just almost like an offshoot of it. So it exists, in the health and safety code, but it has not been applied very frequently. So it hasn't been tested to, flush out what that actually means, what air districts can do. So there's only a couple of examples. One is an older rule from San Joaquin, which is very different. And then the South Coast rule.
Accidentally turned it off. As to the MOU for this, could we, because the idea is that there are more players rather than just the port, could we pick up on the larger ones? And how many were they? Was that 7? Forget how many there were.
At the 100,000 square foot threshold, there's about 250 warehouses
250.
at that number. So it would be somewhat challenging to try
Right.
to tackle those on an individual basis.
And is there like a natural cutoff in terms of the larger ones versus everyone else?
You mean within that 100,000 square
Yeah.
foot and larger?
Yeah.
There's, I think we've got it broken down into 100,000 square foot to 150, 150 to 200, then greater than 200. As you go up in size, the numbers do get smaller. So for example, that highest criteria of greater than 200,000 square feet, I don't know off the top of my head, but I think it's in the dozens. But still probably potentially challenging in terms of an MOU approach with multiple individual
Right.
facilities.
So there wouldn't be like a magic number of like MOUs, like say 10 of the largest, to try to see if we can come up. I mean, that they would be probably the largest generators, right? Or potentially.
Theoretically, yes, based
Theoretically.
on that assumption of square foot, driving truck trip.
Yeah.
We haven't looked at that. That's something that we could look to see. I would venture to guess that the majority of those largest warehouses are probably in that international border community, just because of the way that
Right.
the dynamic works there. But that may be something we could chew on as part of future direction.
Thank you.
Thank you, Member Sanchez, and thank you, staff. So right now I'm going to turn it over to public comment. And so we want to get to the public comments and then we'll move back to board discussion.
Thank you, Chair Bush. We have a total of 10 speakers currently. I will start with those members of the public that are here in the chamber with us. Those members that are joining us via teleconference, I will be calling you either by your name or by the last 4 digits of your phone number. At that time, you will be able to unmute yourself. Please state your name for the audio record. All speakers in person and via teleconference will have 3 minutes to address the board. Please make sure that you self-regulate your time. I will ask that you conclude your comments when your time has ended. And I would remind the teleconference speakers to please mute your live stream before you begin speaking. Our first speaker is Philip Gibbons. You will have 3 minutes to address the board. And you may have to turn on the mic. Thank you.
Is it on?
Yes.
All right. Good afternoon, members of the board. My name is Philip Gibbons and I work at the Port of San Diego. The port supports proactive engagement by staff at the Air Pollution Control District to develop non-regulatory strategies to help with the transition to lower emitting and zero emission technologies in our region. We are supportive of continuing our discussions with your staff on a potential memorandum of understanding or MOU between our two agencies to advance our shared emission reduction goals. The port has been an active member of the AB 617 Portside Community Steering Committee since its inception and has worked closely with APCD on implementation of the Community Emission Reduction Plan. We adopted our own maritime clean air strategy in October 2021 with the vision of health equity for all. The MCAS includes 34 objectives to improve air quality and enrich our neighboring community. Many of our objectives exceed the regulations set by the California Air Resources Board. As a proof point for our commitment to emission reduction, the port and our tenants are investing roughly $85 million in electrification and infrastructure projects to implement many of these goals and objectives in the MCAS. And these projects include a range of operations at the port, from installation of new shore power, acquisition of new cargo handling equipment, including heavy-duty cranes, forklifts, yard tractors. Advancement of the first all-electric tugboat in the United States will be housed right here in San Diego Bay. We're incentivizing truck drivers to convert their vehicles over to electric. And we just issued an RFP to develop the first heavy-duty electric truck stop on port land, the first in San Diego County. Many of these projects have leveraged assistance and funding from APCD. And in fact, one of our main goals in developing the MCAS was to position ourselves for state funding in advance of state regulations. Pursuit of an ISR would likely take many years to complete and may jeopardize our ability to qualify for state funding should these become required, which is important as we seek to electrify as much as we can, as fast as we can. As the staff report concludes, if adopted, a warehouse indirect source rule is anticipated to be the least cost-effective measure APCD has ever enacted. And as staff suggested, this is not even including the Advanced Clean Fleet regulation, which was recently adopted by the California Air Resources Board. As a result, it's unclear whether an ISR for warehouses and ports would even result in excess emission reduction beyond state regulations. Furthermore, there are already a number of regulations aimed at reducing emissions from sources of pollution involving goods movement. Literally, every source of mobile source that moves freight, a vessel, piece of equipment, a truck has a regulation or a soon to come regulation. What we now need are partnerships and new and improved incentives to encourage adoption of cleaner technologies. Just to conclude, the Port of San Diego supports non-regulatory strategies in continuing our discussions with your staff to pursue a potential MOU. And we believe this will serve as a more effective means to reduce emissions in a timely manner. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Nicholas Paul. I'd ask that you go ahead and head to the podium now. You'll have 3 minutes to address the board. Please begin by stating your name for the record.
Good afternoon, Nicolas Paul with the Environmental Health Coalition. To begin, EHC urges this body not to default to a copy and paste version of the South Coast model. Focusing on facilities over 100,000 square feet means that only 243 facilities throughout the county of San Diego would be regulated, which only accounts for about 3.5% of the total warehouse facilities in our region. This regulatory scheme fails to address warehouse emissions in our most impacted neighborhoods. As you all will know already, the port side under this scheme would only have 5 facilities regulated by this rule. In the international border region, where dozens of new warehouses seem to be built every month, only about 14% of the facilities would be covered by this rule scheme. An ISR rule like South Coast that focuses on large square footage storage area does not fully reflect the warehouse composition of San Diego County and does not address the very real problem of smaller warehouse facilities operating near sensitive receptors in our neighborhood. Of the 20 smallest facilities in the port side, ranging from 500 to 1,800 square feet, 14 are located within 1,000 feet of a school, senior center, park, or health clinic. And these places are places where our most vulnerable community members congregate. To be clear, EHC is not saying facilities over 100,000 square feet shouldn't be regulated. EHC is saying that more needs to be done to make sure that ISR improves air quality in our disadvantaged communities, and that there should be renewed focus on addressing warehouse emissions from facilities that operate near our most vulnerable community members. To the point about addressing the Port of San Diego, EHC recommends inclusion of the Port of San Diego in our indirect source rule. We know that emissions from the 86,000 diesel truck trips for both port terminals contribute to poor air quality in our portside neighborhoods. We also know that the Port of San Diego has warehouse facility space well over 100,000 square feet in close range to Barrio Logan and National City parks, schools, and daycares. Having an MOU with the port does not give us the same level of accountability and enforcement power that an official rule does. And we encourage that that we learn from our friends in South Coast who initially attempted the MOU route with the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, but subsequently pursued rule creation after negotiations failed. EHC recommends that APCD governing board direct staff to move forward with the rule development process, with the caveat that additional focus be placed on smaller facilities in our most disadvantaged communities, facilities that operate near sensitive receptors, and include the Port of San Diego in our ISR. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Randy Scow. You may approach the podium at this time. You will have 3 minutes to address the board. Please begin by stating your name for the record.
My name is Randy Scow. I am an executive member with the Industrial and Environmental Association, here representing them here today. I would very much like to encourage the board to take caution with what staff has already stated in their report to you, in their prediction that this rule, the ISR, would be the costliest measure to the district has ever enacted in terms of compliance cost per pound of reduced emissions. All of us have limited resources, whether it be the county, the port, businesses, and so on. And so we just want to make sure that we're getting the best bang for our buck. And on the face here, it doesn't seem like that's the case. Also, I would think that you would want to be prudent with ongoing litigation up in South Coast, and this issue is still being fought over. The foundation of an ISR rule here would be disrupted significantly depending on the ruling up with the South Coast. So I would, at the very least, encourage the district to delay action until the legal consequences of that decision are better understood. And lastly, it has been mentioned as well that CARB has a number of programs going on currently, both the Advanced Clean Truck and the Advanced Clean Fleet Rule may bring significant benefit to emissions reduction here to the port, to the county of San Diego, with no further action required by the county, other than possibly a memorandum of understanding to assist the state in enforcing that rule. So I would really encourage you all to consider not that an indirect source rule is inappropriate, but it may not be the time to move forward with ISR. For those reasons, I would encourage you to delay adoption of this rule until things are more clear and the actual benefits and some of the assumptions that this rule has been built on, which Mr. Medina had some excellent questions on how do we relate square foot of warehouse to actual truck trips? Is it inventory turnover issue? Is it something else? We want to be effective with our rules. And with some uncertainty here, I'm not sure that we can say we will be effective. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is noted online as Alejandra. You will have 3 minutes to address the board. Please begin by stating your name for the record.
Yes, and good afternoon. I apologize. I am at the airport. My name is Alejandra Miriteran. I am the Executive Director of the Otay Mesa Chamber of Commerce. The first thing I want to say is improving our air quality is very important to our community. Competitiveness is also very important for our community. It fuels good paying jobs and attracts companies to our region. I would like the board and staff, and I'd like to suggest 2 programs that could be spearheaded by this board or by staff that would tackle both reducing pollution, improving our air quality, and enhancing our supply chains competitiveness. The first one is a cargo reservation system at the Otay Mesa Port of Entry. We currently have on a daily basis 4,000 trucks crossing every day from Tijuana to San Diego, idling sometimes 4 to 6 hours. A reservation system would drastically reduce idling, which contributes so much to pollution. The technology exists. CVP is open to this. We just need a champion, and APCD can be that champion. A different program would be enhanced enforcement at CARB. We are aware that many truck operators are not complying with existing rules, including the truck and bus rule. We have recently learned that CARB does not really share information with CVP or DOT, and they could be doing so. And if they were doing so, they would basically figure out who is non-compliant and pollution would be reduced. These 2 programs are extremely cost effective and are what I call a win-win situation. Supply chain and trade stakeholders win, and everyone in the community that wants better air quality wins. We fully support staff's recommendation 1A to further explore programs, and we look forward in participating in it. And we sincerely hope the board considers this and does not move forward with a ruling that, as stated by staff, the return on investment is extremely low. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Maritza Garcia. You have 3 minutes to address the board. Please begin by stating your name for the record.
Hi, my name is Maritza Garcia. Good afternoon. I'm a second-generation resident of Logan Heights, a member of the AB 617 Portside Steering Committee, and a mom. My family and I live within 1,000 square feet of 3 warehouse facilities, the smallest being roughly 6,000 square feet. These facilities bring a lot of diesel trucks to my neighborhood, and the amount of pollution caused by all that traffic is very concerning. That pollution negatively affects the health of my community, and the proof is in the very upsetting statistic that we're in the top 5% of most hospital visits due to asthma and other breathing complications. Personally, I've had to see my mom, who also grew up in Logan, develop breathing complications as an adult and undergo multiple surgeries with no permanent solution. We need solutions. The indirect source rule is a huge tool that can be used by the Air District to address air quality issues by encouraging electric truck adoption, encouraging investment in charging infrastructure, and investing funds for filters and other triage methods in our most impacted neighborhoods. We need an indirect source rule, so I encourage this body to move forward with Action 1C with the amendment that additional focus be placed on smaller facilities in our county's disadvantaged communities, facilities operating near sensitive receptors, and an ISR that includes the port. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Cristina Marquez. You will have 3 minutes to address the board. Please begin by stating your name for the record.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Cristina Marquez, speaking on behalf of IBEW Local 569 and our 3,600 union electricians and power professionals in San Diego and Imperial counties. We urge you to move forward with the indirect source rule development process and not delay. We are at a pivotal moment in time right now. Our beautiful San Diego and disadvantaged communities need our help. We must act. We would like to respectfully recommend you move forward with option 1C under the actions in the staff report. Reducing these harmful pollutants around warehouses and ports can create good union jobs if paired with strong labor language, especially for the electrical work using local certified electricians with the gold standard Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Training Program, or EVITP, to build and install electric vehicle charging stations. These are high road jobs, and these projects can create long-term careers, especially in maintaining EV charging stations. Green energy technologies are the skills IBEW electricians have trained on for years, and we have over 650 electricians with the EVITP certification. We are ready. A few examples of some of the projects that our members have worked on. We recently installed the second shore power for the cruise ship pier. We also installed the very first California public medium-duty, heavy-duty charging station at the Otay Mesa border, and we will be installing more charging stations for the San Diego port. We need better, cleaner air today. Please don't delay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Sophie Silvestri. You have 3 minutes to address the board. Please begin by stating your name for the record.
Good afternoon, Chairman Bush and governing board members. My name is Sophie Silvestri, and I work for Pasha Automotive Services, the auto processor and terminal operator of the National City Marine Terminal at the Port of San Diego. If you or any of your neighbors have imported cars in your driveway, there's a good chance they came through our facility. As you know, the port and its stakeholders have been working for several years on the MCAS, which, among other aspirational goals, seeks to collaborate on grants and incentives to assist with the transition of on-road and off-road vehicles to zero-emission technologies ahead of state and local mandates. A few examples of some renewable projects that Pasha and the port have worked on together are as follows: 3 electric Class 8 drayage trucks, 1 electric yard tractor, 4 electric forklifts, and over a dozen electric charging stations. We're also pursuing a 4-acre solar installation on our largest warehouse next year, as well as a shore power installation. Should the APCD codify in ISR the collaborative efforts that we have underway, excuse me, could be, sorry, my screen froze, could be adversely affected. And because grants cannot be used for compliance purposes, this loss of funding could make it more costly and less feasible. In addition, the staff report points out that this indirect source rule could be the most costly in its history as compared to the amount of reductions, the cost per pound of reduced emissions. As you're aware, the California Air Resources Board recently adopted the Advanced Clean Trucks Regulation, as staff just presented, and it's intended to significantly reduce emissions from medium and heavy-duty trucks. The Advanced Clean Trucks Regulation provides a comprehensive framework for compliance and applies statewide, and it appears this might not be specifically addressed in the framework. So the ISR, we think, should be reviewed alongside CARB's plan to determine whether it would bring cost-effective benefits to the community or simply create additional hurdles and expenses. So in this case, we would like to get behind 1A, which is where we and other stakeholders can work with you guys to ensure that the funding and incentives are not impacted by a rulemaking, and defer any rulemaking today and conduct that additional outreach. We want to ensure that there are not unintended consequences impacting this grant funding or ostensibly duplicating existing or proposed regulatory efforts. Thank you so much for taking these points into consideration. And please know there really are businesses like us that are making strides behind the scenes to be more sustainable in our operations. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Sarah Marsh. You have 3 minutes to address the board. Please begin by stating your name for the record.
Good afternoon, Sarah Marsh with Dole Fresh Fruit. Good afternoon, Chair Bush and governing board members. Dole Food Company has been a long-standing presence in San Diego, where our port business plays a crucial role in fueling the local economy and supplying fresh produce to the region and beyond. Our operations here bring 34 million boxes of bananas and pineapple annually, and we employ numerous people directly and indirectly throughout our community. Dole has implemented several initiatives to mitigate emissions and enhance air quality. Our vessels have been plugging into shore power since 2014. We have consistently invested in modernizing our cargo handling equipment, also participating in pilot programs for zero-emission cargo handling equipment. And just last year, we replaced 5 diesel pieces of equipment with zero-emission replacements. To successfully implement these strategies, funding support becomes crucial. Adequate financial resources would enable companies like Dole to accelerate the adoption of cleaner technology. Last year, Dole was awarded funding through the CORE program administered by CARB, and that financing is what helped Dole secure our 5 new zero-emission replacement vehicles. I will also mention that we have previously applied for 5 other grant programs and have been unsuccessful in obtaining funding. Moving forward, Dole's goal is to further enhance our environmental performance by adopting innovative strategies and technologies and going beyond regulatory compliance when possible. Although many of the potential strategies under consideration from the APCD align with Dole's own commitment to environmental sustainability, they would be the costliest measures ever enacted here. Balancing trade, commerce with the protection of the surrounding environment and portside communities is a challenging task. We must continue working towards full zero emission implementation in preparation for future requirements. But it is important to avoid putting the port and its tenants at a competitive disadvantage by mandating specific technologies before infrastructure and funding can be fully implemented. In light of these considerations, we caution against specific mandates and MOUs at this time, but continue on a path of 1A with focused discussions and urge you to prioritize funding. By focusing on achievable and practical solutions, we can strike a balance between environmental stewardship and the ongoing needs of the port industry that benefits both local community and the regional economy. We appreciate the opportunity to provide our perspective and look forward to working together towards a cleaner and healthier future for San Diego and its communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Lauren Casares. You will have 3 minutes to address the board. Please begin by stating your name for the record. Lauren Casares, you may begin by stating your name for the record. You are able to come off of mute. Lauren, are you there? We'll come back to Lauren. We'll go to Leslie Gallegos. You'll have 3 minutes to address the board. Please begin by stating your name for the record.
Hi.
Hello.
My name is Leslie Gallegos. I'm with the CBO Casa Familiar and a member of the International Border Steering Committee. I just want to state that as a concerned community member, I want to first of all highlight that I am in favor of APCD pursuing an indirect source rule. But I also want to encourage APCD to consider other strategies and approaches to include or find other ways to apply this rule to warehouses that are smaller than the 100,000 square feet, such as taking action 1C. AB 617 communities and other underserved communities in the county should not be overlooked, and it should be known that many smaller warehouses are clustered in these communities and they collectively impact and pollute just as much or more than a warehouse that is 100,000 square feet or more would. I would like to encourage and suggest the APCD team to develop other strategies and approach this indirect source rule to expand beyond just including the warehouses that are 100,000 square feet, and to also implement solutions that would reduce emissions produced by the warehouses that are smaller. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll try Lauren Casares again. Actually, I don't see her present, so we will move to caller 8032. Please begin by stating your name for the record.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Craig Benedetto, representing NAIOP San Diego. NAIOP San Diego is a commercial real estate association representing those companies that provide and house jobs. NAIOP's members are committed to sustainability in all they do, be it in the construction or the operation of their structures. NAIOP San Diego is concerned about proceeding with a formal rulemaking on indirect sources. As was noted during the initial board comments, there is pending litigation against a similar plan adopted to our north. The uncertainty involved with pursuing a framework given this litigation warrants consideration on how to proceed today. There are costs associated with pursuing a rulemaking, as your staff noted. You could avoid these costs and the time associated with the staff effort to pursue this for something that will ultimately likely get changed by the courts. In terms of the impact and value of an indirect source rule, you've noted in the staff report that the California Air Resources Board has just adopted a very significant measure to address truck emissions. We think that should be considered in your action today. We did find the staff conclusion that an ISR rule would be the most costly and least effective of any rule the district has considered, another pertinent point. Other alternatives, as other speakers have noted, could well be more impactful in addressing our mutual goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while also protecting jobs and goods movement. For these reasons, while we believe the entire idea should be tabled, we would be willing to support option 1A to allow for continued conversation with our members and others, including the port's tenants, to find meaningful incentives and grants to help address the issues that exist from the distribution of goods and cargo in the region. We appreciate your time and consideration in your efforts to clean our air. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I see no hands raised at this time. However, if there are any additional members of the public that are online that wish to address the board on this item, please.
The right 750-837. Try that now.
Hi, everyone. This is Lauren Casares. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Thank you. My name is Lauren Casares. I'm calling in on behalf of the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce, which represents over 2,500 businesses and 300,000 jobs regionally. We are calling to support staff recommendation 1A. We agree that continued proactive engagement with stakeholders and consideration of alternative strategies has the potential to further reduce emissions in our communities and ensure strategies are feasible and cost-effective. A few strategies that should be researched that may more significantly reduce emissions include a reservation system for cargo at the Otay Mesa Port of Entry, which would eliminate northbound and southbound truck idling, which pollutes our communities at much higher rates. We ask that the APCD also consider supporting the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, in the efforts to tackle non-compliance in CARB programs, such as the truck and bus rule via data sharing and staff assistance. The report produced by APCD staff notes that indirect source rule would be the most costly emission reduction program APCD has ever undertaken, but would not reduce emissions significantly. Option 1A acknowledges these realities and has the potential for more meaningful action to reduce emissions and partner with industry to do so. We appreciate your consideration and thank you again for trying to get me on today. Thank you.
Thank you. Our last speaker is Alejandro Amador.
Thank you. My name is Alejandro Amador, and I'm a San Isidro resident. I'm here speaking in favor of the rule and highlighting the importance of moving this process along. However, I do want to elevate what was shown in the presentation and that the vast majority of smaller warehouses are concentrated in disadvantaged communities. And I want to make sure that we are not overlooking the impact of those smaller warehouses that smaller than 100,000 square feet. I want to raise the opportunity to address them as well in this regulation that, as different board members pointed out, might be producing more emissions through higher rate of good movement. What I'm asking today is to proceed with this process as policy and regulation are always lengthy, but have APCD staff and any contractors that are assigned to work on this rule to develop strategy and policy to also address small and medium-sized warehouses, especially the facilities near sensitive receptors. I also want to elevate a couple of the comments that were mentioned today. I do think we do need to move forward towards innovative solutions such as the cargo truck replacement in Otay Mesa that I've been hearing about. I think we can do both. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That concludes public testimony on this item.
All right, thank you, clerk, and thank you, members of the public that came out. We are now going to move into board discussion, and so we'll move on to that, and then eventually calling for action. Would ask for us to have some, some discussion to just because there's a lot of alternatives we have on our plate. So if we can just talk about one of them, discuss it, and then move on instead of, I just want to try to limit having multiple motions on the floor. But with that, I open up to board member comment. All right, member Elo Rivera.
Thank you, Chair. I actually have another question before we get into motions or anything. The trade-off between the resources required to create a rule or to develop a rule and then implement that. Can you talk to us a bit about that and what the trade-offs might be in terms of where resources might be diverted from, just so we have a fuller sense of, again, the development itself and then potential implementation?
Certainly, I'll try to touch on that. So from the development perspective, we're anticipating if we were to do a similar rule to South Coast and learning from some of the lessons they've learned and applying that knowledge and hopefully getting to see what the result of their litigation issue is. We anticipate that a rule like that would take about 2 years to develop. And so, that would be primarily Randy's staff time spent working on that regulation over the course of that 2-year period. There's some opportunity costs there associated with, not being able to work on other regulations potentially. And then if we were to be asked to look at a smaller suite of warehouses, I think there would need to be some additional research associated with what the impacts are, what the suite of opportunities or compliance options might be. And so there's potential to that would extend the rule development timeline a bit, going into smaller regulations. In terms of the implementation side of the house, as we're currently estimating for a rule with that 100,000 square foot level, we're thinking, at least 2 staff members to bring on board to implement a rule like that. If we were to increase the number of facilities subject to a rule, we'd have to look at, what additional resources would be required. For example, the South Coast regulation, I think, applies to 3,300 warehouses in that neck of the woods. And so depending on what threshold we look at for warehouses here, the total number of warehouses is 6,700 warehouses. That would require a pretty significant lift in terms of ongoing implementation going forward. So, that could vary pretty substantially. In terms of costs, I think from the implementation perspective, we would be able to recoup those costs as part of a rule because we would build in a fee to cover that service that we're providing to those facilities to ensure compliance. So, I guess the short answer is rule development, we'd be looking at least 2 years, possibly longer if we were to expand into smaller facilities, and the implementation component would grow, respective to the number of facilities that apply to the rule. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that. Any other member, Vice Chair Shu?
Thank you. I have a quick question first. When you did the cost effectiveness or cost revenue, does that include the benefit of some of the costs over time? In other words, if you put in an electrical charging station, if you move to EVs, I've been told by the industry folks that even though a truck costs a lot more, maybe more than twice as much more, when you take all that into account, over time, there's a savings because of the reduction of maintenance costs and the cost of the trucks themselves. In fact, that was calculated for MTS buses and shown that MTS will save lots of money if they make a conversion. In fact, they'll save more if they convert sooner, and the technology is changing. So was that factored into the cost benefit ratio?
Nick or Randy can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the cost effectiveness numbers are purely based on cost to comply versus expected emission reduction.
Right.
It doesn't factor in some of those benefits, but Nick, feel free to elaborate if I missed that.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I think that's correct that you explained it right. The only thing I would add would be that, again, this is kind of a preliminary analysis that we've been doing. As part, if a rulemaking were to proceed, we would conduct what's called a socioeconomic impact assessment, which would get deeper into some of the topics that I think you're explaining, that we could potentially dive deeper into that cost effectiveness number to see, one, if our estimates are on par and look correct, and if there would be anything else that could be factored into that conversation.
Right. If we're ready for discussion, I want to start by kind of going into what our charge is. So APCD is here to get healthier air, to reduce the health impacts from dirty air in our community. And for decades, we know the association between these vehicles, heavy trucks and diesel, with illness. For decades, these communities have been suffering from that and increased costs. So when I hear people worry about costs, well, fine. Rather than changing to electric vehicles, making these changes, you want to pay for the hospital bills. You want to pay for the lost time that people have taken away from work, taking their kids to the hospital for emergency room. If you want to account for that money and pay for the last few decades as well, since we're dealing with equity, let's put that into the formula. As we go forward, we're looking for a best solution that another air control district has tried, and maybe we could improve on that as it applies to our region. But let's not forget what our charge is. I don't know a lot about NOx. I don't know a lot about particulate matter, but I know what a real draw is. I know how much worry I had when I didn't want the electricity to go out because I had a filtering system, well, not a filtering, but a medical device for my daughter when she was suffering from asthma. That's our charge. And our methodologies here, I hope, does work. I'm not too worried about time because these things do take time. I'm more worried about how soon we can get it in. That's what matters. If we delay something for another couple of years, we have to think about how many more cancer rates are going to occur. How many more hospital rates are going to occur because we delayed another couple of years. And that isn't in our calculation here. I don't see that in our cost benefit ratio. And to me, that's what we have to take into account. And that's what I think is our charge on this body, to take these considerations from industry into mind and do what we can do the best we can, how we can best implement rules to improve air quality. Because we're not going to be able to ever figure out a cost benefit ratio here. We're never going to put in a cost to someone who dies from cancer because they got too much diesel particulate matter into their bloodstream. And we know where that is. We know that it's impacting the most sensitive communities, impacted communities in our region. And to me, that's what we need to focus on. And that's why what I like to do as we move forward is to have two parts to this motion, because I have a hard time with 1A, B, and C, as if we're separating it. One is, I'd like to see us go forward on the timeline that you had shown in one of the slides in which we can go forward on this. In other words, if we can, as a body, support that timeline of implementing this rule the best we can. I know as we go forward, that may change because of various issues that may come into play, like something might come up and we may have to delay the timeline. But our objective should be to implement that this rule within that timeline. And if we can all agree to that, that sets our goal, sets our target to move forward on implementing such a rule. And then later we could deal with a different motion, dealing with how we're going to go about it and some guidelines with regards to being flexible with regards to the square footage rule. But I'd like to add in there a prioritization, that whatever rule we move forward on, that we prioritize the communities that are most impacted first. Whether we do it with pilot programs, we do it with a timeline of how we implement or whatever. But let's take that into consideration when we deal with square footage, and let's certainly take into consideration number of trips that I remember Medina has brought up. Those are factors that I think goes into calculations. I don't think we have the time to figure that out. But in the end, within a certain reasonable time, 5, 10 years from now, let's see a reduction in the pollution in these most impacted communities, which actually, as the map shows, it goes from North County to San Marcos, all along the I-5. It hits El Cajon, it hits my city in La Mesa. So we're not going to leave anyone out in this. We're going to include everyone in our community as we move forward. And if I could get more discussion or input from other board members before I make my motion, I'd be happy to hear that.
Thank you, Member Shu. We'll go to Member Gloria, then Member Sanchez, and Member Medina.
Mr. Chairman, I have to apologize to my colleagues. My time here is short. I have another engagement I need to get to. With regard to action, I'm supportive of staff, backing up our staff with recommendation 1A. I heard my colleague just mention, and I would share the same urgency. I wouldn't see the formation of a working group as an intention of slow walking this, and I would agree with the prioritization that you're describing. I think we're trying to get the most bang for our buck, not just in terms of reductions, but obviously improved health outcomes in communities of concern. I'd also would expect staff, and it's not stated who's all in the working group, but that it would obviously be inclusive and likely to include, as I was getting to before, I'm questioning the Port of San Diego as they address these some of these issues. But Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure the way you want to conduct the meeting, but and I believe some of my colleagues may have some more questions. But I understand the requested actions, the staff recommendation, and I'm prepared to support recommendation 1A. Yeah.
We'll try. We know it. Thank you, Member Gloria. We know you have to leave in 5 minutes. We're going to get through as much discussion as we can and try to get a motion in 5 minutes. But if you have to leave, we understand that. We appreciate your time here so far. Member Sanchez and then Member Medina.
Thank you. We have been given actually by AB 423, which I think is very critical. A job to do. And the timeline has been indicated to be 2 years. So during that time, we could be doing all this work, including getting out all the information via the CEQA SIA process, and getting a lot of public support for this. At the same time, there's going to be the litigation, but I mean, we learn as we go forward. I do think that we ought to go forward, move forward, and in 2 years, a lot can be different. We know that the state this is something that the state really wants us to do. That these are one of the worst, I guess, offenders for the goal of having clean air. And this is something I would like all of us to be able to say, yes, we're doing this. Thank you.
Member Medina.
Thank you, Chair. I support what the Vice Chair Shu talked about. I think he made a very compelling case for that. And it seems like a lot of the questions that we have can be answered during a rural development period of 2 years. The technology may be improving also in terms of electrification of vehicles, and also not just the technology seems to be there. It's the adoption of that technology by the trucking industry. And so I don't really see I don't see a benefit in waiting. I see mostly disadvantages in waiting. What I would propose though is that we really ratchet down the size of facilities and maybe at this point go from 5,000 up. And then we can prioritize. I'd like the prioritization aspect of it. And so if we can keep it open-ended in terms of the size of the facilities, and also really de-emphasize size as compared to another metric, if we find out that another metric is more viable in San Diego. So with those caveats and modifications, I would support that. And if the motion is made, I will second.
So you're saying for 1C, was that what you were asking for? Or just speaking in support of?
Yeah,
Option 1C?
I think Vice Chair Chu kind of left it a little open in terms of splitting
Sure.
into two. I don't see the need for that.
Okay, got it. Member Gomez?
I just have one question. This is more to council. What is I'm concerned about treating the port differently than the rest. So what is the legality, knowing that this ruling somewhere else is being challenged? Would it leave it to some sort of challenge if we are treating port business differently than the rest? I'm just curious about that.
Do you mean if we were to treat the port side community differently than other areas?
Right now, the staff is presenting the port, we should do an MOU.
Oh, the port.
And then the rest, do something different. I am very concerned about splitting it. I think everybody should be treated whichever way we land, whenever we land. I mean, air quality or air pollution is air pollution.
Right.
So I am concerned about that. So I would love to hear more about how you see this.
Well, I think, the port is a separate source
Correct.
than the warehouses. So it does not legally require the same approach as warehouses. It's similar to, we would adopt a rule for, a power plant separately than we would for, a poultry farm or another source like that. So the port and the warehouses are theoretically just different sources. They don't require the same strategy necessarily. So legally, I don't think there's an issue of moving forward with an MOU with a port versus a rule or another strategy for the warehouses. I think practically speaking, the issue is the port is, one entity. So you can negotiate an MOU with one entity, you cannot realistically negotiate an MOU with, 300 or 500 or whatever different warehouses. So that would be the primary basis for a distinction. Also, the strategies that you would employ, the emissions from both the source, they're very different, a warehouse and a port. So one rule for both also just wouldn't make any sense, right? You would probably have to separate them. The emissions from a port come from ships, and they come from different types of cargo handling equipment. They come from trains. They come from different things. The quantity and volume of emissions is different versus a warehouse. They wouldn't have the same strategies to reduce their emissions. So it would be difficult to write one rule for the ports and the warehouses.
Okay. So what would be the difference between having a memorandum versus a regulation?
Well, a regulation is enforceable in a different way. It is
Correct.
regulatory. A memorandum is essentially a contract. So, that would be a breach of contract is the remedy. So they are quite different in that sense, but in terms of the ability to achieve emissions reduction, there's pros and cons really with the MOU. Like the regulation has to be very much based on our regulatory authority. But MOU is, an agreement between two parties. So if the parties agree to do things a little differently or to do things that we, even things that we don't have authority over, for instance, they could agree to put in strategies to reduce ship emissions that we couldn't require through rule. They can do that through an MOU. So there's different opportunities there too. It honestly, and I think that's why, South Coast AQMD did try the MOU route first, was because it has a potential to just have more flexibility than a rule.
Okay, thank you.
A quick follow-up question. Does an MO, and maybe you kind of already answered this, does an MOU preclude regulations, even though the regulations would take a while to develop, but would having an MOU preclude them from?
I would imagine the port would seek that, but generally speaking, we're not supposed to bind future boards from taking future action. So we would say that we would not allow that.
Thank you. Member Martinez.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Lots to think about, lots to consider. I think this is very complex. Can we go back to the recommendation, the slide that shows the three recommendations? So I do, yeah, if I can get that up, great. So we had it up, yeah. So I think what I'm, just because of all the different testimony that we heard today, staff presentation, I do support having some type of rule, but I think for now, because there's a lot of variables and unknowns, and I'm comfortable with 1A at the moment. That doesn't mean that we can't address some of the exploration of having an ISR. I agree with a sense of urgency, and yes, we're here to protect the public health. I think we need to, I think 1A is a good place to start. And if we find that that's just not working, we can always move to some of the other options. But I just, for myself, I don't feel like I have enough information to confidently move forward with one of the other options at this time.
Thank you, Member Martinez. I'll speak for myself. So I appreciate all the testimony and all the staff work on this. I support us moving forward towards an indirect source rule. I think that's needed. The question is approach. For me, I don't feel comfortable voting on 1B or 1C because I still have a lot of outreach that I want to do, a lot of talking to environmental groups and stakeholders. I think there's this balance between the urgency of, as Vice Chair Shu said, I think that's really powerful. And I appreciate you speaking from the heart on that, there's communities out there who've been suffering and being killed out here for decades, right? So we don't want to push this off too much. I do like the timeline on there that we have or that we had on there. So maybe following that, but I still think there's a lot of legal questions, a lot going on with the South Coast. I'm cognizant of staff resources too on option 1B and C. So I'll say I lean more towards option 1A at this point. I'm still thinking and deciding because it's not easy. A part of me still wants us to move forward with something, but that's kind of my thoughts. Member Burke Garcia and then Member Gloria.
Hi. There's just a lot of information that was given to us today. I have a lot of concerns about the health impact of our disadvantaged communities, our border communities, our portside communities. But I also do agree that there's a lot more work that needs to be done and a lot more information. I think that we can make this better and do more. So I feel 1A gives us that, but I would do 1A with the stipulation that we follow a timeline. Because my concern is if we just say yes to 1A, then everything's going to keep, the can's going to keep being kicked forward. I would like a timeline, like the timeline we had up before. By the end of this quarter, by the end of Q3, we should be proceeding as if we were going to do a rule, but have that flexibility of 1A so that we can encompass more things. And as a board, we could have more information. I think that just gives us a little more wiggle room. That might be my own naivety. I may just need more information.
If I could ask a question, just a quick question. Would 1C include elements of 1A in terms of convening a working group and community folks?
Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, it looks like if you go to 1C, we ignore the community and the industry. And I presume it doesn't. We includes all of that stuff in 1A.
That's correct. There, as part of any rulemaking, there's a public, component, a public process. I think the difference would be 1B and 1A would be proceeding with that, focusing on adopting a rule, whereas 1A is, let's have some discussions about potentially what a rule might look like, as well as other alternatives.
Right. I mean, 1A essentially doesn't allow us to stick to that timeline that you said. That's, to me, that's the difference.
As written, but we could certainly talk about, folding in some,
Well, that's right.
checkpoints.
Okay.
Okay. Member Elo Rivera.
Yeah, I really appreciated the recommendation there of kind of this hybrid. And I'm sensing from staff, the one that I appreciate this recommendation now. I trust this APCD staff. I think you all have demonstrated that you are committed to the mission. If this was 3 years ago, or I wouldn't, if I'm being honest, because of just the way that this agency had been run over time. But I think the mission's clear. And so I trust that this is your recommendation, and I think it's clear where the board here wants to go. And so if we can try to take the recommendation of kind of this hybrid approach where it's 1A with a timeline and with some prioritization, I think that part's been clear and is really important, of ensuring that we're prioritizing the communities that have been most negatively impacted up to this point. I don't know how clear this particular action needs to be, since we didn't technically need this to be an action item, correct?
I mean, not to satisfy the requirements of 423, but I think to provide staff with some direction on
Yeah.
what the next steps are.
Right. So
Definitely.
for guidance purposes, it probably doesn't need to be quite as tight as it might otherwise need to be. So Chair, I'm happy to kind of make a motion out of what the recommendation was from Member Berber Garcia down at the end, and or if you want to make that motion and I can second it. Do you want?
Sure. I'll make a motion that we do a modified or hybrid 1A that has more of a timeline so that we can take a better look at what our rules are going to involve and see that we can be more inclusive.
And I'm happy to second that.
All right, so I'm sorry. So we have a motion by Member Garcia to move forward with action 1A and modify that to include a timeline that was seconded by Member Elo Rivera. Moving on to, so we have a motion on the floor and we'll take further comment and discussion. Member Sanchez.
Thank you. What about 1B, which basically I'm hearing, well, I want to move forward with rural development, and the timeline, that timeline looks good, but I'm not ready yet because I want more information. I think 1B is the one that at least begins the formal rural development activities, that incorporates 1A and gets us moving forward on that timeline that you're talking about. So I think that's actually more of the hybrid that I heard you say, rather than 1A, which doesn't do as much. It's basically let's continue talking, and at some point let's talk about this again. I think 1B gets us back to looking at the timeline and really moving forward on this probably at a slower pace, but we are moving forward. So
Thank you,
that's what I would ask you to consider. Thanks.
Thank you, Member Sanchez. Member Medina, and then Member Martinez.
Thank you, Chair. I think we're moving towards a decision. I would just like to modify Dr. Berber Garcia's motion by either saying, or by both saying that we will give it a year for this period, no more than a year, and that we would move to rural development as part of this decision, that we are committing to rural development after this period. So whatever the period is, if we can negotiate that, I think a year should be, I don't know, do you think a year's enough?
It's a hard question to answer because it depends on how far down the rabbit hole we go and how much additional information is gathered. I think, you know, a lot of it depends on what we're able to learn about facilities, those smaller facilities in that time frame. It's taken South Coast quite some time, 4 to 5 years to develop their rule to get that information for those larger facilities. And so I think there's a bit of an unknown of how much time it could take for us to get into those smaller facilities. One potential thing to consider would be, you know, looking at phasing those in and looking at opportunities where, you know, hey, if we research additional information from facility, you know, at smaller chunks, getting smaller and smaller as we go, could be something worth thinking about. The other thing that I would like to add is, you know, there are components of that rule development timeline that we could certainly advance the ball on, regardless of whether there's that specific direction to move forward with rule development. You know, there's nothing that would stop us from proceeding with procuring some of that contract support that we know we're going to need anyway, right? So we could move forward on those aspects of it. A lot of the discussions that would come out of these working group discussions would certainly feed into whatever we end up doing as, you know, ultimately moving into the rule development component at whatever time frame makes sense. But just wanted to clarify that piece as well.
Okay, yeah, because what I don't like about 1A is that it doesn't say that we're going to develop a rule. And I think the sense is that we are going to develop a rule. So if that is a component in there, I'm willing to be flexible on the timeline because like you said, we're working parallel tracks. And so there'll be some time efficiency in that. So if that's part of the commitment, yeah, I'm ready to support that too.
Thank you, sir. So in order to include an amendment just procedurally, and our clerk has just reminded me, we went through this last meeting. So we would need to call for a full vote on the amendment. So we need a motion and a second in order for that amendment, just FYI. So I don't know that I heard an official. If you want to make an official motion, you can, but yeah. All right, so with that, Member Martinez.
Thank you. So yeah, I still support 1A or the motion from Burke Garcia. I believe what I'm hearing from everyone here on the dais is that we do want to explore an ISR, but the 1A is to work with stakeholders on what that could look like. Like I said, I'm not comfortable moving forward on a rule yet. Just because we have a lot of unknowns. I think we need to gather more information. I definitely agree we have a sense of urgency. We need to focus on communities of concern. And I believe we could still provide additional input and guidance during this process. So it's not like we have to say 1 year now, right? And again, for me, it's really, I do also trust staff, and so I feel like we need to let them explore a little further and then come back to us. So I'm gonna stick with supporting the last motion made to support 1A with a timeline.
Okay. I can make a comment.
Member Shu, and then Member Gomez, did you have a comment? No, okay.
I think this confusion that we're going back and forth is precisely why I wanted to make it 2 different motions. Yeah, because in my mind, when you go with 1A, you're saying we're going to sit back on this and talk to a few more people about it. But that's not what I heard from all of you. 1C includes everything that we've been talking about, consideration of other factors, consideration of 50,000 square feet as it applies. And the reason why I didn't want to go with A, B, or C is because there's no prioritization of where we're going to apply this rule. Well, all we know, we may come up with a rule that will affect the least polluted areas of our region. And that's what has traditionally happened. And I don't think all of us were appointed here to help the air quality in Anza Borrego. But that's what you left open here if you go with 1A. No commitment and no direction to staff to reduce health impacts from poor air quality in our most impacted communities. That's what we need to add in here and emphasize with whatever we do today. And I haven't heard that from any of the motions that have come forward.
Chair, just to point of clarification, there was the timeline mentioned from Member Burke Garcia. I mentioned prioritization based on disadvantaged communities in a kind of affirming that motion that was made.
Yes.
And I just want to make sure that we're clear about the action that's happening here. While we'd have to take action at some point, if I'm understanding procedurally what's happening in this conversation, this also could have been an informational item where we had a discussion. Today's conversation could have been that. And then you all could have come back with a formal recommendation for us to take the formal action required. This is kind of a courtesy conversation in terms of making it an action item. I'm a little worried that we're getting so caught up on this being the exact, I recognize it. We need to eventually provide formal action. I think that this is not our only bite at the apple. I think the sentiment of the board is very clear here. And it would very much surprise me if staff came back with an action item that did not include prioritization of disadvantaged communities and that was completely unrelated to the very clear priorities of this board in terms of ensuring that we are advancing equity and justice as we perform the mission of the APCD. So I just want to make sure that part was clear. Is that I definitely did incorporate the prioritization language, and I would never disregard that. I don't think anyone on this board would.
I think if the clerk, I did leave that out when I reread the motion. So if the clerk could reread what the motion made by member Burke Garcia and seconded by Elo Rivera.
The motion on the floor currently is to provide more of a timeline for the board as well as prioritization of the most impacted communities with option 1A.
As I understand that, our air pollution control officer, executive director would come back to us at the next meeting with what the formation of the working group would be and what the timing would be. That's how I understand it. Is that how my colleagues understand it? So my point here, so for me, where I'm at, I do agree a lot with member Martinez. There's a lot of technicalities of this that I want to learn more about before I send staff on doing something that may not work. And that's why I would like that additional time and that consideration. I like the approach of a working group made of industry, environmental groups, public agencies to convene and work that out. So that's why I support and encourage 1A. None of this precludes us in a couple months. I'm still open to consideration op 1B and 1C. That doesn't preclude us from moving forward with that. I don't believe. I'm the staff. I see them waving. So
No, I just wanted to clarify one thing in terms of option 1B and 1C. The way those are structured currently is that it would direct us to proceed with rulemaking for a rule similar to that South Coast rule at that 100,000 square foot threshold. And so, that's a distinction between 1A and B and C. The concept behind 1A, I think is as you're describing it, Chair Bush, that we would discuss what other options might exist and see where we can best get at those smaller facilities as part of that discussion.
Got it. Because what option 1B and 1C is missing, I don't want to look at just 50,000 square feet. I want to look at less than that. I want to look at even in the metrics. I'm not criticizing staff, but even some of the metrics you all were using, it seems older metrics that don't take into account really the distance. There was a lot of nuances that member Medina brought up that's why I would encourage us to slow down a couple of months, recognizing that, we still need to move forward with a timeline. And so I'm still open. So we still, to me, need to create an indirect source rule. But I would like for us to, work with the stakeholder group and talking about that more and actually working on that direction. So at this point, I'm supporting the motion, but still happy to hear one more round of comments before we call the question. Member Medina.
I like what Member Elo Rivera said, but to me, it means that maybe we just offer guidance to staff instead of voting on any of these things. I think the guidance that, from what I've heard, is very clear. And so if there's a way to to avoid picking one A or B or C because we've hybridized them to the point where they're unrecognizable at this point. So I'm throwing a little grenade into the works here, but if that's not what people want, then I'll.
Only because we have a motion on the floor,
Right.
so we have to,
Okay.
we have to move forward with it. And I think that the motion does that without precluding further action. So any other comments before we take action on the vote? Last comments? Member Gomez?
No, can you just read the motion on the floor, just to make sure before we vote?
With the clerk, could you reread the motion?
The motion on the floor is option 1A with a timeline and prioritization of the most impacted communities.
Just a quick observation. If the expectation was that staff return to the board with a specific time on the next board hearing, it should probably be included in the motion.
Yes, that's okay.
So the motion,
If you would like to include in your motion, Member Birkbeck Garcia, an actual timeframe of, or what you want that timeline to look like and when you want it to come back to the board, you can do that.
I think the idea was that we would come back to the board at our next meeting with recommendations on that, what the longer timeframe would look like.
I'd like to add what they said.
Direct staff to return at the next board meeting with an update on that particular component. And possibly the makeup of the working group as well. I thought I heard that.
clerk, do we want to restate one more time for the record so that we can call the question? I think we're done with the comments here, so.
I'm going to confirm with Vera that this is not an amendment to the original motion per the bylaws.
It's clarity to the original motion.
I think it's clarity to the original motion.
Okay, thank you. Then the current motion that's on the floor is recommendation 1A with prioritization of the most impacted communities, as well as directing staff to return to the board at the next board meeting with a timeline as well as a more detailed stakeholder listing.
All right, thank you. We have a motion and a second. Any last comments? With that, can we call the roll? We have a clarifying question from
Right.
Member Sanchez.
So this, the next item will be the port. Is that correct?
We haven't discussed the port yet, so we can discuss the port,
Okay.
yes, next.
Okay, thank
That's
you.
been,
We're good? Okay. Thank you. Member Birkbeck Garcia,
Yes.
Member Elo Rivera. Member Gloria, Member Gomez,
Yes. Yes.
Member Martinez,
Yes.
Member Medina,
Medina, aye.
Member Sanchez,
No.
Vice Chair Shu,
Aye.
Chair Bush,
yes.
with Member Sanchez voting no, and with members Lawson, Reamer, Vargas, and Gloria absent, that motion passes with those board members who are present voting aye.
Okay, moving on to item number 2, discussion of the port, the staff recommendation for the port pursuing an MOU and returning to the governing board with an update in winter. So can we have can I have a motion on this item? With that, I will go ahead and make a motion to accept the staff recommendation here. Yeah, I'm gonna make a motion to accept the staff recommendation. All right, so we have a motion from Member Bush. We have a second from Member Elo Rivera. Discussion, Member Gomez.
Yeah, I'm not gonna be supporting this motion. I do have some serious concerns about doing a memorandum of understanding for the purposes of air quality, especially in an agency that is right next to a pretty impacted community. And I don't think a memorandum of understanding is gonna get us there. So I don't support that approach.
Okay, understand. Thank you, Member Gomez. Member Shu.
Just have a quick question. What would be in a MOU with the port?
That's exactly what we'd be discussing over the course of the next couple months to try to identify where there are opportunities to achieve strategies that would reduce emissions from the portside community. So that's the request at this point, is to continue those discussions with the port and report back to the board at the end of this year.
And we need an MOU to do that?
Potentially to try to solidify some of those requirements.
Yeah,
in
and
the
I would
MCAS. That's
contend,
the idea.
I would contend there's probably equal, or if not more, that we need MOU then with Sandag as well, since we worked with them as partners in trying to reducing air pollution. So I that's why I'm like maybe other board members and wondering what we're trying to achieve with this MOU.
All right, thank you, Member Shu. Any other, I saw some nodding heads or questions, comments, Member Martinez?
Yeah, the way I see the staff, my understanding of staff recommendation, and even though it's not an enforceable thing, is directing you to pursue a conversation, to pursue strategies. And if we find that that is not productive, then, we escalate to the next step, but at least we're giving an opportunity and a good faith effort to say, hey, we want to work with you. Hey, we need to meet these measurable goals. So I just see it as a starting point, not the end all, and definitely, holding them accountable. So, yeah, so that's why I understand staff recommendation, unless I'm not understanding it correctly.
I think that's the idea behind it, correct?
Thank you. Member Birkbeck Garcia.
And I'm sorry, I'm going back to timelines again. I don't get the timeline on this. Update winter 2023, like what does that mean?
The idea would be we would continue discussions with the Port of San Diego between now and the end of the year. So at our December meeting, we would come back to the board with an update. Ideally, we would have principles of an agreement in place that we'd present to the board. If we're not there yet, we would have discussion about, what the next steps would be to Member Martinez's comments.
So basically, this gives you guys permission, or whatever the word choice is, to have a discussion. You'd come back to us at our end of the year meeting, tell us it's working or it's not working. And then from there, we can give more direction, like if it is working, like let's proceed. If it's not working.
In a best case scenario, we would come back in December with an MOU requesting the board to approve that MOU that would include, some of the commitments to reduce emissions.
Member Medina.
Just a question and maybe clarification from Vera. My understanding is that if a rule is pursued, there are properties within the port boundaries and even the Navy that might fit into the ISR rule, and that the difference between pursuing something specific with the port is that it would expand the types of sources that would be covered by such an understanding that go beyond what let's say the parameters of a warehouse and distribution center rule. Is that correct?
I think that is accurate. So the theory would be whatever facilities on the port property that would be subject to the indirect source rule, like if there were warehouses over whatever square footage we land on, those would still be subject to the indirect source rule if we were to move forward with that regulation. The idea behind the MOU is looking at some of the opportunities for other sources outside of warehouses where we could identify some reductions, building off of the work that was done on the MCAS.
And those other sources that would not be covered by an ISR, are they, in terms of volume or quantity of emissions, are they more significant than what an ISR would cover?
Potentially, for example, ocean-going vessels are the largest component of emissions associated with the port. And so if there are opportunities to address emissions from those sources as part of the MOU, that's something that we would explore. Whereas the warehouse rule would be focused solely on activities surrounding the warehouses on the port.
My last question is, would the word MOU obligate us to some more commitment than just saying, go ahead and explore opportunities with the port to develop an understanding or something? I mean, I don't want us to go down the road and then say we can't come back from it. That's.
If I'm understanding correctly, I don't think providing us direction today to move forward with pursuing an MOU locks us into that.
Thank you.
And MOU does not preclude us from the working group or anything else that we'd be working towards an indirect source rule, correct?
I don't see a conflict there.
Okay. Any other comments before we move on to the vote? I think that, you know, for me, again, this is us directing staff to delegate and them doing the work, and at least it moves forward on something. I personally don't think an MOU will solve all the problems, but I think it's a good step to move forward with something. So unless it precludes or is inconsistent with something else we're doing, I'd really like to call the question, support the staff on this. Anything else? All right, hearing none, we have motion and a second. Could you clerk, could you reread the motion, second the language? I made the motion.
We have a motion by Chair Bush, seconded by member Elo Rivera for staff recommendation 2, which reads, based on staff's research to address indirect source emissions from ports in San Diego County, direct staff to pursue a MOU with the Port of San Diego that includes emissions reduction, facilitative, and health protective mitigation measures, and return to the governing board with an update by the end of 2023. With that, member Birkbeck Garcia,
Yes.
member Elo Rivera,
Yes.
member Gloria, member Gomez,
No.
member Martinez,
Yes.
member Medina,
Medina, I.
member Sanchez,
Sanchez abstain.
member Shu,
Sure, aye.
Chair Bush,
Bush, yes.
with member Gomez voting no, member Sanchez abstaining, and members Lawson, Reamer, Vargas, and Gloria absent. That motion passes with those board members who are present voting aye.
Great. Thank you, clerk, and thank you, board, for a good, healthy debate and discussion. I know it goes back and forth a lot, but you know, this is what is needed, as messy as it is sometimes. So appreciate your patience. All right, moving on to the Air Pollution Control District Deputy Director report. Mike?
Thank you, Chair. I'll make this quick. First, just to let you know, we had our most recent all hands meeting at Felicita Park in Escondido last month on May 16th. We had 150 staff in attendance, and the theme this year was diversity, equity, inclusion, and employee engagement. And I want to thank Chair Bush, Vice Chair Shu, board members Martinez and Birkbeck Garcia for participating in the event. It was good to see you all out there, and the staff really appreciated it. Next, APCD staff participated in 3 panels at the annual Industrial Environmental Association Conference, which was held last week. We held an APCD update panel with staff from across the district. Paula Forbes also participated in an APCO panel with 2 other APCOs from the Mojave Desert and Bay Area AQMD. And senior engineer Janya Lofgren participated in a panel about professional development at the boot camp series at that event. So it was a good opportunity for staff to get out there and engage with stakeholders. Next, I want to provide a couple updates from our air toxic hotspots program. BAE Systems has sent out their air toxic hotspots annual public notification and will hold their public meeting on Tuesday, June 20th at 5 p.m. Pacific Ship Repair has also sent out their air toxic hotspots annual public notification and will hold their annual public meeting on Thursday, June 29th at 5 p.m. And we're also reviewing 3 other air toxic hotspots annual public notification plans for NASCO, Encino Wastewater Authority, and Vulcan Materials in Otay Mesa. And last but not least, I would like to introduce Stephanie Nicholas, who's our new chief of our support services group, who started with us last week. Stephanie comes to us from the county's Planning and Development Services Department and brings a wealth of experience on implementing process improvement processes and budget and fiscal programs. And we're very, very excited to have Stephanie part of our leadership team. This concludes my report, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mike. Any board member questions on the presentation? One comment, you mentioned a conference, and one thing I would like the APCD to follow, there is a zero emission bus, a national zero emission conference. I think it's September. So if just staff can know about that, I'd appreciate our participation in that. So yeah, I think it's September, and it's a zero emission vehicle bus. It's something with zero emission vehicles, and it's a conference in September. Yeah, you can just note that. All right, with that, I'm moving on to Planning and Policy Committee report. Member Gomez. Anything to report from that committee? All right. So with that, that is it for our meeting today. We are adjourning, and the next meeting will be held August 10th, 2023 at 2 p.m. Thank you.